There was a house that remembered storms, a small crooked thing tucked like a secret among a ring of trees that kept their mouths shut. The house sat with one dim window, a sagging roof, and a front step that had learned to bow to wait. It held the quiet of too many nights and the soft ache of unfinished apologies. In that house lived a girl named Elara, who carried the world's small cruelties in the shape of a thin, steady spine. She was not a heroine yet, not by any bright proclamation. She was simply a child who learned to measure hunger and hope in the same breath. Elara's days began before the sun broke its own silence, when the forest was still half dream and half shadow. She moved as if she had practiced being small. Her hands were careful with the few things she owned: a cracked mug, a faded satchel, a sweater that carried more patchwork than cloth. There was nothing theatrical in her survival, only the steady choreography of someone who had been taught to slip through life with a low profile. Where other children woke to the clatter of breakfast and the bustle of busy houses, she counted spoons and rationed silence. Sometimes there was bread. Sometimes there was only the memory of bread. Sometimes there was a neighbor's thrown-away warmth, a soup bowl left by a thoughtless kindness and gathered like an offering. Her mother came home late more often than not. When she arrived, she carried a tiredness like a garment, and a face that had practiced looking away. The absence between them was not always sharp. It was a slow erosion, missed lunches, unkept promises that sounded like lullabies, the way hands avoided meeting where they might be asked questions with no answers. Elara learned to fold love into small pockets she could hide in her coat. She learned to be the one who thanked the world for what it gave, even when it gave almost nothing. School lay a long, dangerous mile away through the forest, a path that felt like a trial every day. The trees there were not kind, they were witnesses. Branches reached out like skeptical fingers, and strange noises taught her how to keep her steps steady and her gaze fixed. She walked that long road alone, sandaled or booted depending on what the week had provided, carrying a satchel that rustled with books and a thin crust of hope. At school she moved through corridors like a shadow, noticed and then not noticed, tolerated but never asked after. Children can be small instruments of cruelty. Names were made into darts and thrown with a casual aim. Mockery found its mark in the way her clothes hung, in the way her hair caught the wind, in whispered stories stitched together to make her smaller still. No teacher stepped into the circle of those darts. Authority moved past with the practiced blindness of grown-ups who believed their distance made them kind. In classrooms, she sat near windows and drew little worlds at the margins of the page, trees that bent toward light, small creatures that glowed from inside. Her art was private liturgy, a language she used when words were too dangerous. She sketched warmth into the world because heat was what she needed most but could not demand. At night, she curled on a thin mattress and listened to the sounds that filled the old house, pipes singing, moth wings like tiny sighs, the wind rehearsing the same old promises. She cultivated a steady, stubborn heartbeat of resilience, and sometimes, in the dark, she let herself imagine a different life, one with doors that did not creak and with hands that stayed. The forest watched her. It marked her footprints the way a careful chronicler marks the passage of time. For every small victory, finding a coin in a crevice, a warm walk home on a day when rain had been predicted but decided to spare her, there were countless little defeats. Hunger met her like a companion. The humiliation of being singled out at school and the absence of intervention became a kind of echo that followed her home, where a cold stove and a mother who carried shame in the hem of her skirt awaited. The world seemed to conspire to teach her endurance over joy, patience over celebration. She learned to be resilient without being fully allowed the soft gift of being seen. Then, on a twilight when the sky had the color of an unspoken thought, the particulars of her life shifted not with a crash, but with a gentle insistence. She wandered deeper into the forest than she ever had before, not because she sought adventure but because there are nights when sorrow needs space to unfold, and a walk becomes the only reasonable answer. As fog hovered low and the trees made their patient silhouettes, she felt a presence that was not human and not frightening. It was a light at first, a warmth that was not sunlight but something softer, like a memory of sunlight. The light gathered into a being that hovered between leaf and air, a small aura that hummed with a kindness she had not been trained to expect. That being had a name, Lumen, and that name felt like the promise of illumination. Lumen did not thunder into her life with impossible demands or spectacular miracles. He arrived as one might arrive at a bedside, with soft hands and a willingness to be present. He moved in a way that made the forest lean in, as if the trees themselves wanted to hear what he had to say. His glow was reassuring rather than blinding. His touch rearranged the world with the patience of a careful gardener. He offered no grand bargains. He offered small changes that accumulated like stitches into a new fabric. At first, the changes were private and tender. A berry bush that had been bare the previous day bore tiny fruit that hummed with sweetness when Elara put it to her lips. A kettle that had remained cold for nights warmed as if someone had given the stove a sleepy push. Coins that seemed to have vanished from the world reappeared at precisely the moment they were needed. These were not fireworks or proclamations that everything had been fixed. They were small, exact acts that met immediate needs and taught Elara to notice possibility where she had only seen lack. Lumen did not perform miracles so much as he rearranged small facts of life, aligning them with intention. He guided a worn foot down a different lane and arranged for chance encounters that felt anything but accidental. He nudged a woman named Rosa, the owner of a bakery with flour-dusted hands and a face like a map of kindness, toward the path Mara took as she passed the shop. That meeting was not cinematic. It was a gentle rerouting of two lives that had learned different languages for hope. Rosa spoke the kind of words that are currency when shame is the main coin one carries. Welcome, steady work, a place where hands could be given purpose without judgment. Mara accepted, at first out of need, and then with the dawning realization that honest labor could stitch a seam in a life that had frayed. Lumen did not stop at arranging jobs and food. He began, in his quiet way, to teach Elara how to see herself outside the narrow mirror the world had held up. He did this not by telling her what she was, but by showing how small acts could be reclaimed as proof of worth. A sketch placed on a bench was admired by a teacher who normally paled at the edges of human trouble. A small show of confidence in the corridor caused a rumor to shift and lose its sting. The bullies, who had banked their power on certainty, found their certainty slipping as Elara's posture altered imperceptibly. She learned to hold her head in a new way, one that suggested she had the right to occupy space. As days folded into weeks, Mara began to change too, as if some river of shame had slowly encountered a dam and found a way over. Honest work threaded the edges of her life with a steadier rhythm, and with that routine came the capacity to be present. It did not erase the past. It simply gave her the option to answer differently. Where there had been excuses and absences, there began to be small acts of repair, a warm meal left on the table, a hand that stayed a moment on Elara's hair before morning. The mother's eyes softened as she learned, clumsily and with frequent back steps, to show up in ways that mattered. The father, long a ghost in the margins of Elara's life, someone who had walked away and left behind a photograph with an edge worn thin by yearning, was not immune to Lumen's influence. The spirit did not coerce remorse or contrition. Instead, through a careful arranging of coincidence and memory, old letters found under a floorboard, a neighbor who mentioned a name at a market, Lumen nudged an absent man toward reckoning. He found pockets in a life he had thought too busy for return and began to understand what his absence cost. When he finally stepped back into the world of the house in the woods, it was with hesitant apologies and a willingness to do the hard labor of mending. None of this happened overnight. That was the point. The reformation Lumen offered was the patient kind that honors human error, and insists on slow rebuilding. Elara watched these shifts like someone watching a bud you had considered dead begin to swell. Her own growth was not only about necessities being met but about the internal architecture of courage being constructed. She discovered the small brilliance of her artist's hand and poured effort into it. When a teacher who had once been blind to her existence recognized the talent and offered her a place in a school art show, Elara hesitated as if fear could wedge itself into opportunity. Then she accepted and, step by step, learned that praise was not a trap. Confidence arrived by increments. She began to stand where once she would have folded, and the bully's taunts less frequently found their mark. Sometimes courage was simple, raising a hand, saying no to a cutting remark, choosing to keep a friendship with those who were kind rather than chasing approval from those who were cruel. The forest itself, which had once felt like a ravenous spectator, slowly seemed kinder. Sunlight found new directions through the leaves. Shadows warmed at their edges. Lumen's glow changed everything not by removing shadow but by teaching Elara how to situate herself inside light. As the family's life stabilized, decisions that had once been dreams became plans. Mara's work at the bakery steadied the household income. The father, who returned not as a savior but as a man with a ledger of mistakes, worked to make restitution through steady presence and silent labor, repairing the creaking boards of the house and learning, in small, earnest ways, how to be trusted. The house itself began to fix its posture. Windows were mended, a roof shingle found its place. The world around them reflected the inward work. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes began to nod. Kids who had once mocked started to ask about Elara's sketches, curious now because her certainty had begun to magnetize attention. The time came when staying in the old house felt like closing a book too soon. A chance presented itself, an opportunity in a town where light was less reserved, where doors and streets hummed with possibility. It was not a sudden escape but a considered step toward a different life. They packed what little could be carried, folded memories like warm blankets, and moved toward a city that promised both challenge and kindness in new measures. Lumen walked with them to the edge of the forest and did not follow into the city. His work was the forest's kind of magic, subtle, planting seeds, his purpose fulfilled in helping awaken the human capacity to mend. The city was a palette that required learning. It was louder, stranger, and kinder in irregular ways. Elara found space to breathe. She enrolled in classes where her hours at a table sketching felt less like hiding and more like practice. Colors in the city were brighter not because the sun had changed but because the life she had built allowed her to see them. Friends came not all at once but as neighbors and classmates who carried their own complexities and were generous enough to ask after hers. These friendships were curious and ordinary and steady. They laughed at the same jokes, shared lunches, and argued about music, but they also showed up on hard days with smoothies and an open ear. They were diverse in skin and speech and story, and that diversity taught Elara the exquisite fact that belonging often grows where differences are met with curiosity instead of suspicion. With friendship came a budding romance, gentle and age-appropriate, that felt like a new color in her life's long painting. A boy who loved the same quiet bookstores and who carried a careful kindness found his way to sitting beside her on a park bench and listening. The kind of affection that grew between them was patient and respectful, an exchange of small gifts, shared headphones, a hand that briefly touched to steady a wobble, a note tucked into a notebook like a bookmark for the heart. It was not the center of her life but an addition of warmth and ordinary joy. The bond helped complete a larger picture where love became layered, parental willingness to atone and stay, friendships that felt like found family, a partner who asked for consent and listened. Elara's art flourished in this new light. She painted and sketched with a fervor that felt like the pressing of a life into shape. Her work, delicate scenes that mixed forest magic with city geometry, found a place in a small gallery show and later in the hands of people who said that her paintings made them feel seen. Recognition was not an altar, merely a mirror that reflected how far she had traveled. She learned the craft of being proud of labor, and the grace of receiving praise without flinching. The trajectory that began in a dim house beneath a canopy of trees folded into a richer present. Mara's steps grew steadier, her apologies less frequent and more honest, the stamps of her past less sharp and more worn smooth by time. The father, who had once been absence made flesh, became someone who showed up with fixed tools and stubborn patience, sometimes clumsy but always present. The family did not transform into a picture of perfection. They became instead a house of people practicing repair. Disagreements still happened, old wounds sometimes bled. But there was now an infrastructure of care, a shared dinner table, a habit of asking after the day, a practice of listening without judgment. Years can compress in memory, and they can stretch, but the arc of Elara's life settled into a steady brightness. She cultivated friendships that matured into partnerships of work and laughter. She and her boy, now more companion than crush, walked through neighborhoods, arms linked in a way that was both tender and ordinary. Her art became a form of currency not because of wealth but because of connection. She taught younger children to draw, and in teaching she found the exquisite loop of giving forward what had once been given to her. Lumen's presence receded like a tide that had done its quiet reshaping. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep or in the hush between breaths, she felt the ghost of his glow, an impression like heat left on a stone. She never saw him in the city. He had been a forest answer to a specific need. He had not been meant to replace human hands and human courage. He had been the beginning of a lesson, that help can come from unexpected geometry, and that the smallest wonders, when taken together, can transform a life. When she returned, years later, to the ring of trees where the old house still kept its memories, it felt like visiting an ancestor. The house had been fixed and repainted. Neighbors remembered the days of absence with an ache that was softened by the image of the family now standing in the doorway. Elara's chest tightened with gratitude and the odd, sweet sting of memory. She walked the old path and realized how much of her life had been created from decisions that were never spectacular, choosing to get up, to draw, to stand when it was easier to curl, to show up as imperfect and willing someone else to be imperfect with her. Her life became a quiet testament to the power of small, persistent kindness. She learned that redemption was not a single jolt of light but a series of small illuminations, a loaf of bread appearing when hunger was sharp, a job offered without judgment, a man returning to the work of being present, friends who stayed, a love that asked only for honesty. The theme that threaded through her days was not miraculous rescue but the slow, patient realignment of possibilities. She had been given a chance to reconstruct her life, and had done so not by magic alone but by the mundane labor of showing up again and again. In the end, surrounded by friends and the family she had helped recompose, Elara reflected on the many forms of kindness she had received and learned to give. She understood now that light was not merely the absence of dark but the active choice to create spaces where light could enter. She saw that forgiveness was not a license to forget, but a tool for building anew, and that healing was the stubborn, loving repetition of small acts. Her final understanding, the one she would speak softly to anyone who would listen, was that hope is not a thing you inherit, it is a thing you practice. The forest that had once felt like a corridor of isolation had become, in memory, a place where a lantern named Lumen taught a girl how to stitch a life. The city taught her how to sell those stitches to the world. Her journey did not erase scars. It gave them room to breathe and taught later hands how to dress them with care. She had once been a child who learned to survive. She became a woman who could help others find survival's softer call. And so, standing in the warm light of friends and family, Elara felt an unfamiliar ease. She had known hunger and cold and the aching distance of absent hands. She had known shame and the sting of being made smaller. She had also known small mercies and the kind of reformation that arrives when someone else's light teaches you how to make your own. If the story has a single instruction to leave behind, it is this: the most radical thing any of us can do is to offer persistence. Persistence in kindness, in showing up, in believing that small, careful wonders can stitch the world into something worth staying in. Hope, once practiced, spreads. It is the quiet revolution that begins with one warm loaf on a windowsill and grows until an entire life is transformed.